exactly 900 words. Here's the script. In 48 BC, the greatest library on Earth caught fire, but nobody in power ever agreed on who struck the match, and the reason why is darker than the fire itself. You were taught the Library of Alexandria burned once. One villain, one night, case closed. That's not what happened. And the confusion isn't an accident. Alexandria, Egypt. Founded by a Greek dynasty called the Ptolemies sometime after 300 BC. Not a building, an institution. Kings paid ships to dock and hand over any scroll on board, just so a copy could be made for the shelves. Scholars from across the known world came here to think for a living. 500,000 scrolls, maybe more. Nobody agreed then, and nobody agrees now. Euclid worked here. Archimedes visited. A woman named Hypatia would later run its remnants. This was the internet of the ancient world, and it belonged to no single nation. That's the first clue something's off. An archive this important, this funded, this documented in its own time should have an exact inventory. It doesn't. Here's the first fact they don't want lingering in your head. Julius Caesar didn't mean to burn it. In 48 BC, trapped in Alexandria's harbor during a civil war, he set enemy ships on fire to save his own skin. The flames jumped the docks. Warehouses caught. Some ancient writers, Plutarch, decades later, said the library burned that night. Strabo, who visited Alexandria after, never mentions a fire at all. He describes the library still standing, still functioning, decades after Caesar supposedly destroyed it. Two credible ancient sources, two incompatible timelines. One institution somehow both destroyed and operating at the same time. It gets stranger. Because the library doesn't die once, it dies at least 3 more times on paper. In 270 AD, Emperor Aurelian crushes a rebellion in Alexandria, and the surrounding neighborhood burns, library included, or so some accounts claim. In 391 AD, a Christian mob under Bishop Theophilus destroys the Serapeum, a daughter branch of the library, on direct orders to wipe out pagan temples. Ancient writers actually watched that one happen in real time and wrote it down as it occurred. Then, 5 centuries later, a story surfaces claiming the Muslim Caliph Omar ordered the last scrolls burned in 642 AD to heat public baths for 6 months. A story with no source anywhere close to Omar's own lifetime. One most historians now believe was invented long after he died, by writers with a grudge against the Muslim rulers of Egypt. But here's what doesn't add up. Every single version blames a different group, Romans, Christians, Muslims, and every single version was written down by someone with a reason to point the finger elsewhere. Caesar's biographers wanted to protect his reputation. Christian chroniclers wanted the destruction blamed on outsiders, not their own bishop. Later European writers wanted a clean villain to justify centuries of hostility toward Islamic Egypt. Nobody who wrote about this fire was neutral. Not one. That should bother you more than the fire does. So what's actually buried here isn't a scroll count. It's a pattern of institutions rewriting blame to protect themselves. And that pattern only works if the original record stays vague enough to argue about forever. Rome needed Caesar remembered as a builder of empire, not a man who accidentally torched the world's knowledge to save his own skin. So his role got softened into a footnote, a fire that may have spread. The early Christian church needed its own violent purge of pagan learning, the actual, documented destruction of the Serapeum in 391, buried under a bigger, older, more forgivable story about a fire centuries earlier that wasn't their fault. And later historians, writing during centuries of conflict between Christian Europe and the Islamic world, needed a villain from the other side, so they resurrected a caliph who'd been dead 500 years, and handed him a crime with no contemporary evidence behind it. 3 separate institutions, 3 separate incentives, one convenient, foggy story that lets each of them hide their own fingerprints inside everyone else's. The library wasn't destroyed in a single catastrophe. It was strangled slowly by underfunding, by neglect, by repeated smaller purges, and that slow, boring, institutional death was rewritten into a single dramatic fire, because a fire has a villain, and neglect has an entire ruling class. Once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it. Ask yourself how many other great losses in history, a burned archive, a vanished text, a destroyed temple, get compressed into one clean, blamable event, when the real cause was years of quiet institutional decisions nobody wanted their name attached to. The Library of Alexandria isn't unique. It's a template. Every empire that has ever needed a scapegoat for its own neglect has reached for this same trick. A single dramatic villain is easier to teach, easier to forgive, and easier to sell than the truth. Knowledge usually dies from apathy, not arson, and apathy has too many fingerprints to ever prosecute. So the real question was never who burned the library. It's how much of what we call history is just the story institutions agreed to tell instead of the one that actually happened. And nobody has ever accounted for the rest.